Hey everyone, thanks for making it to my talk. Hope you've been having a great conference so far. This one should be a fairly light one. We're not covering any particular technologies, but instead talking about how we can use communication to better advocate for security. Before I go into the details, let me give you a little bit of background on myself. So I'm a lifelong programmer. I have been doing it since I was a very young teenager, and I currently work for Asurion. Although I come from a product development background, I've always been fascinated with security. And that led me to join the Security Mavens program with a bunch of the fine folks in this room, where I was able to learn how to evangelize security to my peers. I got several certifications, and I won a few Capture the Flag events, including the one that got me this awesome drone. By the way, if you haven't checked out Security Innovations Capture the Flag event, it's awesome. You absolutely should. And recently, I transitioned to work on application security full-time under Mark about a week and a half ago. So that's probably pretty similar to all the other perspectives that you're going to hear at this conference. The perspective that I'd like to add is from the very nerdy, equally nerdy activity that I participated in college, which was competitive college debate. Debate has always been fascinating to me, mostly because the human psyche is both really interesting and extraordinarily frustrating. There is no pseudo command that you can run on human beings to get them to do what you want. Your only legal recourse is to convince them to your point of view. And this is very difficult because human beings are complex, oftentimes irrational beings. But I participated in the activity anyway, and I got a few accolades through the process, including being named to the All-American team in 2014. I still get involved with the activity from time to time, and I coach for Vanderbilt here in Nashville every once in a while. So why is it important to be persuasive in security? The main message that I'm going to send is that it doesn't matter how smart you are about security and how well you know your craft if no one's listening. If you come off as standoffish and that people don't want to engage you on topics, it doesn't matter if you're right because they're not going to listen. They're going to disengage from you. And in general, security professionals in particular get a really bad rap. Oftentimes, security professionals come off as standoffish or are disinterested in moving the company forward. They're very idealistic and they don't understand the business. And that's a shame because we understand the business, we understand risk, and we can communicate in a way that is more persuasive to business stakeholders. I've seen this firsthand as a developer. I've had many conversations with product managers that say, you know what, I truly believe in the mission of security. I really want to work with these folks, but I know if I involve the security team, it's going to slow us down, and they're just going to bog us down with X, Y, and Z. And that's, again, a shame. And now that I'm on the security team, I am trying to, fix that issue, but more so just show that it's not really an issue, because people just build up this image of what the security team looks like. And in reality, we have some awesome security leaders that are able to communicate very well. In this talk, I'm going to be providing some of the tips that I learned in my undergraduate career as a debater to persuade folks that security matters and how to implement security. I surely believe that the smallest of changes can add up to tremendous differences. So with that being said, let's talk about debate. Before you can get into specific debate tactics, you first need to know who your judge is. So in the context of an academic debate, your judge is someone who decides whether or not you've won or lost the debate. In debate, it's not your goal or even possible for you to convince everyone in the world of your argument. It's just not practical. Instead, you convince the one person that matters in the conversation, and that's the person who determines that you've won the debate. In the real world, you can think of these folks as your stakeholders, the folks who hold power in the decision-making process. You'd like to be able to persuade everyone, but you should focus your energy predominantly around those stakeholders. To illustrate this point, I'm going to read a very short, abridged quote from my favorite movie on the subject, The Great Debaters with Denzel Washington. "The judge is God because he decides who wins or loses, not my opponent. My opponent doesn't exist because he is a dissenting voice to the truth that I speak." Now, in the real world, stakeholders, there's many of them. There's not a single judge that you deal with. In fact, sometimes the person that you're arguing with is the stakeholder. The problem that people get into is they oftentimes assume that the person they're having an argument with is the person who holds the cards to power, and it's just not always the case. Sometimes that person's just making some academic arguments and has no sway in the decision making. Now, again, it'd be ideal to communicate your opinions and persuade everyone, because that person one day might become a stakeholder. But if you find yourself going through a rabbit hole where you're just not getting anywhere and you're just getting into fights with folks that ultimately don't make the decisions, it's important to politely disengage once you've determined that the conversation is no longer productive. You only have so much time to invest in a day, and it's important that you spend that time in the right places. Now, once you know who your stakeholder is, it's important to form a personal relationship with those folks. I did this a lot as an undergraduate. I talked to my debate judges much more than my fellow debaters. I got lunch with them, I played board games with them, and in general, I tried to understand who they were and what their beliefs were. Did this create a conflict of interest within the debate round? Possibly. I'm not an ethicist, I don't know. But did it result in me winning a lot more rounds than I would have otherwise? Absolutely, no question in my mind. So I try to do the same thing in the workspace. I try to meet folks and try to understand who they are. And I don't just do this in order to persuade people of security, but also to, again, fight back at the perception that security folks are unprofessional or unapproachable or non-friendly folks. You can be an example to prove otherwise. And if you're, acting as a person that's easy to approach, perhaps they got this whole image of the security professional wrong. So I try often to do this by understanding people's personal lives before I get into work details, because some people can get overwhelmed by if you just talk to them about work. They want to, understand you as a human being, and you should reciprocate. But once you understand them, you should understand what their goals and motivations are within the company. We'd like to think that everybody within an organization has the same goals, and that's just not the case. People in different job functions have radically different goals. For example, technical leads care about writing code that is secure that would result in them not getting called at midnight because of an outage. Product managers don't care quite as much about that because they're not getting the call at midnight. They care about experimentation, getting data, and providing shareholder value with new products. These goals can be aligned, but they aren't inherently aligned. And it's important as a security professional with another goal in mind, the goal of evangelizing security and making sure that these new products are secure. You need to package your arguments in a way that is most persuasive to your audience. So talk about how security makes products better. Talk about how security makes it harder for hackers to take down your system. Adapt your message in a way that is persuasive to the person you're talking to. In addition to job function, there are also people who have fundamentally different beliefs about security and privacy. Some people don't believe that security or privacy is really that important, and in their personal lives at least. And to be honest with you, I'm kind of the same way. I'm a very boring person. If you found out all the details about myself, it really wouldn't affect my life in any material way. So how do you influence someone like me to care about security? Well, you tell them that when you're launching a product that is insecure, you're not gambling with your data. You're gambling with your customers' data. You're gambling with the image of your company. And if enough customers leave your company, you'll have less revenue. Less revenue can result in layoffs. That could be the end of your job. At the end of the day, I care much more about collecting a salary than I care about the inherent human right of privacy. So that argument is much more persuasive to me personally. But you have to adapt depending on who you're talking to. So now that you know who your judge is, we can talk about, I already covered that point, sorry. Now that you know who your judge is, let's talk about debate tactics proper. And I'm going to start with the tactic that I think is really interesting and very counterintuitive, which is that agreement is actually a good thing. People assume that to debate means to disagree, and this could not be farther from the truth. If you disagree with people for the sake of disagreeing, it makes you look like you're argumentative and that you don't want to come to the truth of the matter, but instead you want to score points with that individual. That's just not productive. And I see this all the time when I'm coaching younger debaters. I'll tell them that the sky is blue, they'll come back and say, no, the sky is green, what are you talking about? And after you train them to stop doing that because it makes them look silly, they'll still get caught up in every single argument that you have, even if those arguments are irrelevant to their overall point. This may sound silly because we are talking about young children, but in the real world, we do this all the time. Everyone in this room is at one point guilty of making an argument not to move the conversation forward or to solve problems, but to look smart. It doesn't make you look smart. It doesn't score you any points. It makes people not want to work with you. It's important that when you can, you should concede and agree with as many arguments as possible that don't go against your overall thesis. So in the case of security evangelism, oftentimes people will respond when I mention a vulnerability that this vulnerability is, very theoretical. It's unlikely that this would happen. And you can say, you know what? in general, it is theoretical. But we have all these other factors that play into this being a very serious flaw. And in this particular instance, it does matter, and here's why. If you provide that nuance, it gives you credibility, because you're showing that you are willing to admit when an issue is not a real issue. In general, agreement is a very powerful tool. One specific manifestation of this that I learned in debate is called what we call the permutation. The permutation is an argument where you try to dismiss your opponent's advocacy by explaining how what they're talking about is not mutually exclusive with what you're advocating for. So the classic example, I see a vulnerability that I determine is a must fix before we go to production. And they say, no, we don't have the resources to fix this issue. It's due next Friday. We have a tight deadline. There's nothing we can do about it. This is when you have to ask yourself, why not both? Is it impossible to reconcile these two goals? I don't think so. I think there are many things we can do to both launch on time and launch with our risk minimized. Some practical examples that you can consider are deploying a web application firewall that blocks obviously malicious traffic, using the principle of least privilege to ensure that the service accounts that you're using cannot go haywire, deploying the application to an isolated stack so that if this application is compromised, it would minimize the damage. It wouldn't spill over to other accounts. Launch to a small subset of users instead of launching to the entirety of the world. Or, perhaps most persuasively, take out the most problematic features. It truly blows my mind how infrequently this option is considered. Okay, product manager, I'm going to take you for your word. We have a delivery commitment for next Friday. It's codified in a legally binding contract, and if you don't deliver, you will literally be executed by a firing squad. Okay, I'll take you at your word. Tell me where in the contract it says that this widget needs to be on this page with this functionality for every single user. You can't do that because that would imply that your customer knew what they wanted before they asked it from you, and that never happens. I'm from product development, I get it. So let's see if we can launch this product without the problematic features and fast follow next week by re-adding it once the security flaw is resolved. I think most people acting in good faith will recognize that this is a valid option that's worth considering, at minimum. So by agreeing, you're able to build up your credibility. And credibility is critical within debate and in security. And all too often, security blows away their credibility because they mention how they have, as Peter mentioned in the keynote, thousands of vulnerabilities that are all critical. And they'll mention this on these theoretical vulnerabilities on systems that maybe don't have a lot of traffic or fundamentally don't have any important private data on them. This is the equivalent of crying wolf, and it's a great way of quickly burning your credibility. Despite what your static analysis tool says, not all high and critical vulnerabilities have the same business impact in all contexts. So it's important to be able to look at that nuance and be able to explain why a vulnerability actually matters from the business stakeholder's perspective. That way, when you come to them with vulnerabilities in the future, they'll know they're not just blowing steam, that you're actually talking about real vulnerabilities that can affect the business. And you should speak about these vulnerabilities in very concrete ways. It's okay to theorize about, it's possible that thousands of records could be stolen, but what would be better is to steal those thousands of records. Show that it's possible for an outsider to do this cyber crime. Now, obviously, make sure you get permission from the appropriate authorities, both within your company and with law enforcement. But this is a very persuasive way of showing that this is a true vulnerability. At that point, it's no longer theoretical. It has literally happened. And if I was a bad actor, I could use that data for malicious purposes. And we don't want that. Now, when we see issues, we need to make sure that we communicate them in a calm, collected manner. We want to make sure that we don't come off as paranoid conspiracy theorists. Again, that can affect your credibility. It's not just the way you communicate, but also the terminology that you use. And there's one term in particular that really fascinates me in application security, the term of the internal threat. The idea that there is someone in your company who's out to get you or is out to sell your data for espionage. Now, there's no doubt, there's no question, let me be clear, insider threats are a real thing. In fact, recent studies show that 3 out of every 4 breaches that have happened in recent history have originated from an insider. The problem is that it's a very tough to swallow psychological pill to say that your coworkers are out to get you. It makes you unsafe, it makes you not want to show up for work the next day, and as a result, people are really unwilling to think about security in this way. And the great news is you can talk about it in a very slightly different way and make a huge difference. For example, instead of saying that your coworkers are evil, say that occasionally they make mistakes. Occasionally they get phished. And if they were able to be phished, now we can have this external threat that uses the internal insider as a vehicle for their exploit. And it happens to everyone. Everybody gets phished every once in a while. And if you can tell people that, they'll be like, I'm vulnerable to this vulnerability, and I'm way more competent than my coworkers, so of course they're going to fall for it. And you can play off of that and show them that it's not about your coworkers being evil. It's about them making mistakes from time to time. Another strategy that a lot of people take that I really recommend you don't do is hide behind policy. It's a great way to silence the conversation, but it's not a great long-term strategy because it hurts your credibility. It says that I don't have a reason for explaining why this policy matters. I'm just going to tell you to shut up and do it because your higher-ups told you to. And that's not great. Worse yet, if they find out that a policy perhaps is outdated and actually condones a particularly horrible security vulnerability, now they can flaunt that in your face and be like, hey, we were condoned by our policy to do this horrible for security thing, so you can't even come at us anymore. So I think it's a lot better to talk about policy and why it was instantiated in the first place, which is that it was based on what they thought at the time, at least, was best security practices. And we can validate those best security practices with recent research, and that it's not just arbitrary. We're not just slamming down the gavel. We're trying to do something good for our customers and something that our clients and stakeholders care about. I can't speak enough on how important the little things are. I try to craft my messages to people in very meticulous ways. I use things like emoticons, exclamation points, GIFs. Yes, I said GIFs, that's how it's pronounced. And I utilize these. I utilize these to come off as an approachable person. I try to do this in the vein of our corporate culture here at Asurion, to show them that, hey, I'm a friendly person, I'm one of you, you can talk to me about these issues, I'm a reasonable human being. You want to make it hard for them to not like you, because what they want you to do is they want you to be jerks, because then they can blow you off. Who cares about listening to a jerk? But if you're really nice and they don't give you the time of day, they're the jerk. And now they feel bad. And they're probably going to come around and say, you know what, I probably should have given you 5 minutes of my time. How important is my time that I can't give you 5 minutes of my time? So here are 2 images of chats that exemplify this. Both of them are theoretical, obviously. But the first message, I put a lot of ideas into why I crafted it this way. I put a lot of nuance here. I'm not going to go onto each individual thing that I put in here, but one that I want to highlight is the second sentence, where I say, I noticed a potential issue that I think you'd be a great person to talk to about. This shows that I respect them, and I think they're a subject matter expert on this subject. So I want to listen to them, and that their time is valuable to me. Who's going to blow off someone who treats them like this? I wouldn't. If someone did that to me, flattery will get to them everywhere. I mean, I'll give you some time to talk about my subject matter expertise. Whereas the second, obviously hypothetical user is saying, you're doing something wrong, I'm going to assume the single worst intentions, and I'm going to scold you for it. And obviously this is not real, but you'd be surprised how many times I've seen messages very similar to it. So just wrapping up, I wanted to talk about the cases that don't go properly. So all of what I said today is assuming that people are already engaging you and that they're already working with you on fixing things in the design phase. We all know that's not always going to happen. There's going to be vulnerabilities, there's going to be breaches. What's important is that you respond to these vulnerabilities and breaches in a way that is calm, collected, and doesn't force people to become defensive and retreat. Individuals don't like to be blamed for things. And even if they're willing to accept responsibility for something, if you rub that fact in their face, they're going to stop talking with you. And they're going to withhold information from you in order to avoid that negative incident from happening again. That's the worst possible scenario, because in order for you to solve vulnerabilities, you need to know about them in the first place. So that's why I recommend, as most of the folks at Asurion recommend, following the idea of a blameless postmortem, where instead of pointing fingers at any one individual, you talk about ways that you can improve the culture and our practices overall. Even though a single line of code can result in a breach, it would be asinine for us to get blamed, find the individual who committed that line of code, and then burn them at the stake. That's just so unproductive, and any company that did that would be a company I would not want to work for. Instead, talk about how, hey, you wrote this code and it got through code review. How did that happen? Is there something wrong with our code review process? Are people just rubber stamping pull requests? If so, that's problematic. What about if we had a better discussion in the forefront about how to solve this in the design phase? Maybe it wouldn't have even been necessary to write this code in the first place. So by examining all points of failure, you're able to not blame a single individual. And as a security expert, you can even say, hey, I could have done better. I know better next time. I will engage you in a better way. So I'm sorry for the part that I played. That builds credibility and shows that you're not trying to hurt any individual. You're trying to get to the truth of the matter. So that's all I got. Thank you so much for attending. Here are some of my sources and some thank yous to my coworkers who got involved. And a special thanks to my undergraduate coach, Joe Adult Schatz, who has been a coach to me both within debate and outside. Any questions? Yes?
Do you have any material or this is design flaw. Yeah, do you have any materials on debate that you recommend people who are interested in getting the discipline?
Absolutely. I believe it's Steinberg and Freely wrote a book about debate generally, and I think it's phenomenal. I'm forgetting the exact name, which is hilarious, and if you were in debate, you'd understand why. But I'll forward that to you because it's a great general resource. I also included in my references a slide to like what the permutation is, and that's a technical term that they use in debate, and they go into extensive detail about what that means in the context of a plan versus counter-plan debate, which is the technical term. Great question. Anyone else? I think it's Steinberg and Freely are two folks that are involved in debate, and I believe they wrote a book. It's Freely, but I'll get the specific name right after this talk. It's a great book, most certainly. Thank you. Argumentation and Debate by Steinberg and Freely. Thank you. Yeah, it's a classic. Yes?
How many times do you have to deal with persuasive argument wrong before you got it right? Did you practice it or did you just...
I started debate at 19, so 19 years. Probably take off a couple of years because I couldn't communicate as like an infant. But I was fortunate enough to participate in debate before I got into the workforce, and I'm extraordinarily thankful for having that experience to build those skills and my emotional intelligence, which I did not have at all prior to the activity. Anybody who knew me prior knew that I was a very socially awkward person who didn't stick to the point. But thankfully, obviously I'm still learning. Everybody's learning. It's a craft like everything else, but I'm lucky enough to have come in with a decent foundation. But I'm constantly learning, just like with any other activity. All right, thank you so much.